Begun.
USAID, and he will be speaking with regard to not only the financing of it, but what are the building blocks? What are we finding out needs to be in place in order to have successful development of your clean energy space? Now, those of you in Washington may have read recently an article about solar energy in the paper, and I think what's interesting is that it was pointing out to what happens when you start to have maturation of markets in renewable energy. And that's a lot what Alan will be talking about, because while clean energy is really important for off-grid sources, it's very important for grid sources too. But we can't ignore the fact that many cases either intermittent or they're variable resources that are coming in, wind, solar, and they have their own characteristics that really need synchronization in the grid. And ultimately, if we are to expand electricity around the world and in many of our USAID developing countries, then we're talking about grid expansion too. So I think it's just sort of natural that he comes after Stephen, where you're really sort of talking about how do you scale it up? How do you bring it to maturity too? And then we'll go into an open forum. The two of them will pose a few questions to each other, and then we'll open it up for the audience here and webinar. So the webinar people, please, if you hear issues that you want raised or questions, please write those down. We will have Joan Steiger, who is going to be responding and collecting those questions. We're also, for those online right now, doing some polling questions of who is attending, what is your interest, what would you like us to hear in the forthcoming 2 or 3 years. CEADIR project, we have a slide on it at the back of the presentation. It's about a 4.5-year project. It goes through September 2018, and it's about a $19 million project, or $20 million almost dollar project too. So it has money to work across 3 areas: clean energy, sustainable landscapes, and adaptation. We are now today focusing more on clean energy. The next speaker, the next session on April 14th, will be looking at sustainable landscapes and financing for those, because each of these areas, clean energy, sustainable landscapes, adaptation, take a little bit different business models and take different sort of blended money from either public and private sector. So with that, I'll go over the picture of myself because you all can read it who wants to read it. But let me just talk about some misconceptions about climate financing, particularly in the clean energy and renewable energy space. What we find is that despite the fact that renewable energy have been part of many grid programs and off-grid programs for a good 20 to 30 years, and of course some places longer than that, we still see that a lot of people believe that the major source that's really motivating climate financing is coming from public funders, from donors. And that may be true in the startup aspect of the market, but it has to, or it will, as it matures, transition into more private sector involvement in it. And that's part of the point here, is that even now, what you'll see with Steph's data is that it's not, the majority of funding is not from public sectors, but it's actually from private sectors. Then, of course, when we say we're talking about the private sector, we go into the issue of profitability. And that's something that you'll also hear from Alan when he's talking about and in fact, what you'll see is that the reality is that 67% of capital flows for climate change mitigation and adaptation is coming right now from the private sector, according to recent data put out by the Climate Policy Institute as of 2014. The last bullet basically says that about most of that, of the capital flow to the mitigation and adaptation from the private sector, is mostly for clean energy, which is somewhat what you would expect because it's a more mature market too. But now you also come back and say, well, are these still competitive? And there have been very, very important changes, technological price points changes over the last 5 years, 10 years really, as far as the competitiveness of different renewable energy systems, such that we saw more recently a 2 cents per kilowatt hour estimate for solar. And this is a bit of an outlier. We acknowledge that it's a rare situation, but it was mentioned in the one resource or reference, the climateconomy.au. It came out just recently. So for those who still think that it's way out there, that's not the case anymore. In some cases, and you'll see with Steph's data, the actual avoided cost is very competitive. There is a combination of looking at things as levelized cost of energy. There's also levelized avoided cost of energy too, which is a more recent and the pie chart, which is slide 6 for those following along on the webinar, is looking and breaking down some of those numbers. I mentioned that, as you can see, about 57% of the money is coming from private developers or companies. In other words, they're funding it from their own resources, they're funding it from equity investments, or going out and getting some loans. Come on up here. And then they've got about only 6% of that is coming from the involvement of banks, which is the private financial intermediaries. And then you look at it and you've got 37% coming from either public intermediaries, which are the donor organizations, and then 3% coming from actual governments too. So as you see, there's a mix of monies coming in. And what's interesting is that in more mature energy markets, you'll see that that 6% from financial intermediaries is much higher. So that's part of a transition we want to see. We're looking to see if it will happen with regard to this market over time too. So where are we going today? We're first starting off with Stephen Munro's from BNEF talk with regard to some of their overview and their global view. They've got Climatescopes that have looked at 55 countries in the developing world. These are countries, there are 10 countries in Asia, there's 19 countries in Africa, and there's about 26 countries in Latin America. So they've got a very broad view of these sort of 55. Probably most important is not necessarily a statistically reliable sample, but it is an important sample of countries that they've done their climate scopes for. And you can talk to Stephen later if you're more interested in finding out information about them. And then we're going to be drilling down and talking about, how do you scale these up? How do you start to move from a small portion of your resources coming from renewables to actually integrating a lot more, a higher percentage? I think Alan uses the marker as 12%. As Alan will say, at that point, when you start to have serious grid integration, you may be investing as much money in grid integration as you do in just generation for the grid too. So those are some important sort of financial points to think about. And of course, what we'll be talking overall is who's making these investments. Part of the message of today's talk is the fact that as we scale up, the investors will be changing over time. And we want to be looking at how do they change over time, and mature China are coming on more significantly, as like Brazil and other countries are coming on. And who's making those? How do we track them too? So at that point, I will sit down and let our two experts talk. But Stephen Munro is a policy expert. He'll tell you that he's now doing work for the U.S. Markets and all, but has done works globally before. So he's well versed in all of this. He has covered a lot of the regulatory and actions and understands very well the policy regime and enabling environments of many countries. And he's also worked at a variety of other places on energy data collection too. So with that, I'll introduce Stephen and let you take it.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. And thanks, Marcia, for your introduction. I'll get my picture off there so we can get down to work. In terms of introductory remarks, let me make a couple of blanket statements. First of all, when I talk about forecast in this presentation, I'm talking about forecasts that we completed in the first quarter of 2014. We'll have updated forecasts available next month as we wrap up our first quarter scopes around the world. But what we're working with now is 2014 forecast data. When I talk about Africa, I'm talking about sub-Saharan Africa only. When I talk about North America, I'm talking about Canada and the US. Mexico is not included in that blanket statement. I hope not to trip and fall down. And most importantly, I want to give credit to my colleagues whose data I'm going to be presenting here today. BNEF has more than 100 analysts and data collection specialists located outside of the US, and many of whom are located in the developing regions that we'll be talking about today. And it's their work that I'm presenting here today, and I want to be sure to give credit where credit is due. As Marcia mentioned, Climatescope is one of the products that I'm sourcing data from today. Climatescope is a BNEF production funded by some very generous organizations, including Alan's organization, the USAID. And what Climatescope looks at is the investment attractiveness, the clean energy investment attractiveness of what are now 55 countries, including a number of states and provinces in India and China, located in the developing world. The second source of data that I'll be presenting today is our own proprietary in-house data streams that I've basically taken and localized in the developing, localized on the developing world. So it's kind of a hybrid. When I talk about Climatescope nations, I'm talking about these nations. And we're using that, we at BNEF use Climatescope as a proxy term. Capacity and cost of energy. This slide shows the power capacity, that is overall power capacity, both clean and otherwise, in the world. And basically what it shows is that, as expected, the OECD countries, the developed world, which are portrayed in the light green bars, have most of the capacity. The developing world, which is referenced as Climatescope countries, are the dark green bars. They have less capacity in place, but are more rapidly growing amount of capacity, and that's what's borne out by these two lines. The light blue stripe shows that the capacity additions taking place in the Climatescope countries are about 7%, were about 7% in 2013 on an annual basis, versus about 2% in the developed world. Focusing more specifically on clean energy development, and by the way, let me define clean energy. We're talking about generation here only, not about efficiency technologies. And the generation technologies that we mean when we say clean are biofuels, biomass and waste, geothermal, small hydro, solar, and wind. In the developing world, again, the Climatescope world, if you will, we see annual growth approaching 18% of these types of technologies as of 2013, versus a still healthy but much smaller 10% in the developed world. And this is further evidence of, I think, what you'll see as a theme of what we're talking about today, which is that not only is so-called clean energy economic in most parts of the world, but it actually is being applied in the developing world, in most parts of the developing world, at a faster pace than what we're seeing in the developed world. This chart, it's rather complicated, but hopefully I'll be able to make it a little simple. What we've done is taken the industrial rates of electricity in the Climatescope countries, which are here on the bottom axis. And just to illustrate what I mean, in Haiti, the industrial rate of for electricity on the grid is about $400 per megawatt hour. In Tajikistan, it's a fraction of that. It's close to free, because estimate, our global estimate of the levelized cost of energy for solar and for wind. Now, LCOE is a broad instrument. Basically, what LCOE means is the price of power that a developer would be seeking in order to pay for the developer's fixed variable costs of development, plus financing, plus a rate of return. So as I say, it's a very broad, oversimplified perhaps, instrument, but it nevertheless gives us a measure, a comparative measure. So the upshot here is that if you overlay these costs, you can see that about half the countries, basically beginning with Nigeria, up to Haiti, in those countries, the existing cost of power is somewhat more than the cost of solar in 2013. If you look at wind, which is somewhat less expensive than solar, it's actually more like 2/3. In other words, from Zimbabwe through Haiti, you can see that the cost of these renewable of wind is more economic on a unit basis for a project developer, I should say for an energy user, than the local grid power. Let's take a look at a couple of slides of new build, or I'm using here solar. This is a solar build chart, and what this illustrates is what we've seen is really as a sea change in the world. Looking, up to the present and looking backwards, you can see that up until roughly 2012, the amount of solar build in the world was dominated by Europe, and Europe being this large green bar here. But since about 2013, we've really seen a switchover, and we expect to continue to see that advance in new build for solar in the so-called developing world, in this case signified by China, India, and the rest of the world. Giving a little bit of a more detailed look at the history that's going into that, you can really see a change from west to east in terms of solar finance, which of course leads to solar build. In the quarters, say roughly up to the beginning of 2012, the dominance was clearly by the European nations and North America. Moving ahead and coming up pretty much to the present era, you can see dominance shifting to the APAC region, in which the two biggest economies are India and China. This is a look at another forecast and history of wind installations by region. And the reason I chose this slide is to demonstrate that the distribution of solar installations has been relatively stable across the regions, going back to 2010. And we anticipate that it'll continue to be relatively well distributed. However, there's a couple of things to point out here that I think illustrate the power of policy, if you will. One is the relatively dramatic fall off that we expect to see between 2015 and 2016 in China. And by the way, for those of you who are online, we're on slide 16. I don't know if that's being called out or not. What's happened in China is that the government has instituted feed-in tariffs, very generous feed-in tariffs for wind development. And we expect those to be fully subscribed by the end of this year, which will result in a fall off in subsequent years in the rate of wind installations. The other outlier or call out here is the US, which we see dramatically, that's the light blue bar, declining from a relatively healthy level of more than 10 gigawatts next year to a mere fraction of that in the outer years. And that also is a policy development. We basically see the end of the US production tax credit resulting in a strong, explaining this decline. Now let's look at some countries and country groupings. And again, I'm going to primarily talk about either investment dollars or individual sectors. And what we're showing here is annual investment in clean energy as previously described in sub-Saharan. Albeit at a relatively low level. You can see that in previous years, basically up till 2012, no fewer than 5, and in some cases 6 countries were experiencing clean energy development. In 2012, the South African government put into effect a couple of tenders, utility scale tenders for wind. And you can really see how the effect that had on a relatively small pool of investment. So when we talk about, when you hear talk about South Africa being where the action is in Africa for investment, while that's partially true, and currently it may be true, it's not going to be true forever. Unless South Africa makes some policy changes or somehow discovers fusion. Looking ahead to sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that in fact the share of we anticipate there'll be about $3 billion each being expended in the contrasting regions. Looking at wind, again, what we're seeing is and by the way, this is a forecast. What we see is a current period in which South Africa dominates, but as time goes on, we anticipate things being a little bit more even, but South Africa will remain a leading destination of wind investment for the foreseeable future. In the case of solar, it looks pretty much the same. The interesting thing about this graph is the presence of what is solar thermal technology. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, solar thermal is a technology that has strong growth prospects in Africa as opposed to many other regions of the world. And it really, what it does is it relies on the heat of the sun rather than the sunlight to generate electricity. The advantage of solar thermal is that it can have dual applications. It can also be used to heat water and create steam. And so in rapidly growing economies where there is a need for hot water or steam for mining, for example, there's some high potential. And you can see that solar thermal is going to be claiming a significant amount of capacity development going forward. Geothermal is a very exciting area when we talk about Africa, and the reason is because in East Africa, what we see is a geothermal resource that really is matched elsewhere in the world only by what we see on the western rim of the Pacific in terms of the potential for electric power generation that is proximate to population centers. So as a result, we have what I think is a relatively aggressive forecast for geothermal capacity development in sub-Saharan Africa. So let's move over to our hemisphere, or to this hemisphere, I should say, and look at what's been going on here, and then maybe take a look at what we think is going to happen. Probably the big takeaway from this slide is the importance, if you will, or the centrality of Brazil and what has happened in Brazil in recent years. Brazil is a country that has been a leading investor and developer of biofuel resources, largely based on state policy. And up until recently, Brazil really dominated the picture in Latin America in terms of biofuel investment and development. More recently, though, we've actually seen biofuels fall off dollar-wise and become eclipsed by wind. And what's happening there is the first steps with wind project development in Brazil, but we're also seeing extrapolation of the wind model to other economies in the region, most notably Mexico, and to a lesser extent, Chile and Argentina. Mexico's role in the future in Latin America is huge. It will, in coming years, we believe, assume a role that is much more commensurate with its population and its financial potential, largely based on policy changes that have taken place Central America. Mexico, the growth of wind in the next 6 years is going to far eclipse what we expect to see in the smaller economies to the south of Mexico. In the case of solar, it's in the longer term, we're talking about roughly the same thing. In other words, future, the most concentrated and sustained growth taking place in Mexico. You may wonder what's going on here with Honduras this year. Well, what's going on is that Honduras has released one of the most generous feed-in tariffs for solar, and I think it's about $185 a megawatt hour, which is 18.5 cents, by the way, in contrast to the 2 cents that Marcia noted being available perhaps in Australia. So you can see what I mean when I say generous. But anyway, that will be fully subscribed by the end of the year. And at that point, again, we'll begin to see Mexico's solar grow. Finally, let's look at India. Very exciting for us, and largely this is predicated development there related to the incoming Modi government. The story in India is that the Modi government has adopted as a goal universal power access for everyone in India at home by 2019. To make that happen, there's going to have to be dramatic increases in investment and installation. And the reason that renewables, specifically wind, and even to a greater extent solar, are going to be a big part of the mix is because of the absence of grid access in a large part of these territories that are currently not served. Stating more simply, solar can be applied where there is no grid, as I think everybody here realizes. In the case of solar in India, it's even more dramatic, and that's largely because in 2015, we're already seeing a big boost in solar build as a result of a government tender for solar development that took place last year. And I should say that government tender was also repeated in a number of Indian states. So that's going to conclude the presentation of the formal slide presentations that I have to make today. And I hope that if you have any questions, that I'll be able to handle them a little bit later on.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And so some takeaways that you can see in this is the patterns are shifting not only because of price competition, but also because of regulatory regimes too. You'd see some boosts up and then some drop-offs when perhaps subsidies, or you had just and China to a lesser extent, well, China also, but you saw it as really important in India too, is that there are certain building blocks in order to make that type of transition into much more reliance on clean energy, and what does it mean as a mix in the economy too. So Alan is going to be talking next with regard to what he and his office have been looking at as the 5 building blocks. And Alan has worked for quite a while. He's obviously right now the director of the Office of Energy and Infrastructure. He's worked on reform in electricity utilities for many years. He's worked often on the actual, he and I were talking with some actual private developers helping to negotiate purchase power agreements too. So he's been on both sides of the fence with regard to helping utilities in negotiation of clean energy coming online. He's also been looking more recently at what it means to bring renewable energy significantly into a grid, and how does that affect the pricing not only, but also what do you have to do with the system planning too. So I think that's where he's going to be taking off, ending up again with the financing of it as one element of the building blocks, but saying that as you get a more mature grid model where you have renewables in or clean energy in, you're talking about a different set of issues having to go on, and therefore a different set of factors that you need to figure into your pricing of those resources for the population and for the consumers too. So, Alan.
And what goes on as clean energy is scaled up. As Marcia mentioned, it's not a static environment. As you scale up, you begin to hit maturity issues and constraints that have to be resolved. I'll go into these in my presentation. In 2012, my division got very interested in the factors that are driving scaling up in markets that are really taking off. And the markets that we looked at were ones where you're getting tens of thousands of megawatts of deployment of new RE. Those were places like Germany, the UK, Brazil, China, South Africa, India, and a few other countries. And the question that we asked was, what is happening in these countries to enable the scaling up of renewable energy? As you move up the curve and introduce 5%, 10%, 15% renewables, what do you have to do with the system? And during the period from 2012 to today, what we discovered is that there are a set of building blocks that are associated with the scaling up in many of these countries. Now, what are these building blocks? The first one, I'll go into each of these in more detail in a moment, but the first one is competitive procurement of generation. That means reverse auctions. It means competitions for building capacity and running capacity. The second is smart incentives. That basically means incentives that evolve with experience and with scale. The third is grid integration, which is quite important in countries that are hitting the 10 or 12% level of renewables in generation. The fourth is locational concentration. That basically means concentrating your capacity in places that have the better resources and using the concentrated generation to bring down your cost of the evacuation infrastructure. And finally, financing support. I should have called it creative financing because it really refers to what you need to do with the financing market to enable the challenges associated with where you are in the renewable scaling up program to be attractive as an investment opportunity. When I say investment opportunity, I'm really referring to projects that are close to investment grade or investment grade. That would mean BBB type projects, the projects that institutional investors would like to get involved in. So going over these one by one, a reverse auction, how many know what a reverse auction is already? So almost half of the group here. It's basically an auction where you start out with a reference price, a ceiling price, which could in the past be a FIT, but you say to the bidders, bid the lowest price that you're willing to offer to build 500 megawatts or 300 megawatts of capacity, and we will award the power purchase agreements to the parties that give the lowest prices. So basically what you do is you stack the bids from the lowest bid to the next lowest until you reach the capacity that you want to procure in that auction. What does that do? It's actually, I think of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle when I'm talking about this. When you put the reference price in place, you don't know what price you're going to get. It depends upon how smart, how eager, how in most countries, and this is empirically verifiable, is that the prices start out high. This is exactly what they did in South Africa. And with each subsequent bid, they will decline, typically until they reach a sort of current market price, the best possible price that's possible. And the nice thing about this is that as prices decline, the utilities and the policymakers say, the lower the price, the more we want. It's a typical supply-demand relationship. As it gets cheaper, the utilities begin to say, this is reaching parity with my other alternatives, with thermal generation and so forth. So if you look at Bloomberg data for India, for example, wind in India is somewhere between 6 and 8 cents a kilowatt hour, depending upon the location you put it. Obviously, if you put it in a high wind area, it's cheaper in cost. The right now, according to Bloomberg's numbers, domestic coal is about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Imported coal this is actually 2013 bid figures, was about 8 cents per kilowatt hour. So wind is right between domestic and imported coal. That's going to cause policymakers to say, we want more of it. Where is this happening? It's happening in a lot of countries. Most countries are actually replacing the use of feed-in tariffs, or most countries that are scaling up, with reverse auctions. Why would you want to do a reverse auction? Why would you want to do a feed-in tariff if you could just tell parties, bid your best possible price? Incentives. If they see that an incentive is not affecting enough capacity, they'll typically raise the subsidy level or the incentive levels. If they get lots of bids, then they'll lower the incentive levels. Now, I'm going to briefly mention grid integration. You all know that solar PV and onshore wind are both variable resources. That means as the wind and the sun go up and down, your generation is also ramping up and down. So if you take a small number of wind turbines this was in South Africa, as the clouds pass over your wind turbines, you're going to get a lot of fluctuation in output. It's going to drive the system operator crazy because they've got to have ramping resources to keep the system at a constant voltage and frequency. One of the things that you can do, and I'll show you a broader spectrum of them in a moment, but if you increase the balancing area, 300 wind turbines over 500, I can't remember the square kilometer, over a much larger area, the variability is balanced out because your cloud cover is not constant in many parts of the year. So that's expanding balancing area. I'm sorry, that last slide was a wind slide, and that's the variability of wind that you're seeing there. For solar in South Africa, you see with 9 plants over 50 square kilometers, you have crazy because they have to compensate. If you expand the balancing area, you get a much more predictable output curve. Why do we focus on grid integration? Well, you have to cope with variability. That's number one. As you reach 8 to 10%, that's basically your reserve margin capacity, the variability becomes a very important destabilizing factor if you don't deal with it. The variability also affects clean energy prices and project bankability. If you look at China, for example, there was a period where about 10 or 11% of the output had to be curtailed, and about 10% of the built fleet could not be connected to the grid because the grid couldn't absorb all of the peak energy output. This is a slide that shows you the things that can be done to integrate renewables into the grid. The slide was put together by Jacqueline Cochran at NREL. That's down here in the margin. But it shows you that there are things that can be done with system operation, with markets, with load, flexible generation, and so forth. Some of these are very low cost. So for example, grid codes, all you have to do is change the grid code to say there will be a certain amount of curtailment, or you have to be able to deal with reactive power. Others of these are very expensive: chemical storage, transmission expansion. So obviously countries are going to want to go for more of the low-hanging fruit, and gradually as they scale up, they will invest in the more expensive options. Locational concentration. This reduces clean energy prices due to higher capacity factors, and it also does the wonderful thing of spreading your common infrastructure costs, your transmission, your substations, and so forth, over a lot more megawatt hours. So the idea is that you put your capacity in places that have the highest capacity factor, the best resources. That higher capacity factor drives down prices, and your cost per unit for transmission is lower because you have high volume. I often hear donors talking about, let's do mapping of resources, let's do mapping. And I feel that now is the time that we need to move forward from that. Every square inch in some countries has probably been mapped by donors before. The key thing now is to move on to the planning of common infrastructure, where challenges of developing common infrastructure, how do you get the sequencing right, and then proper planning. If you're going to have, let's say, 5,000 megawatts in 3 large farms in Indian states, in Rajasthan and Gujarat and so forth, and those farms are ramping up and down along with the cloud cover, you're going to have to plan in advance for the variability, for the grid integration. Here's a graphic depiction of the grid integration challenge. In Texas, you've got a lot of wind up in these areas. I guess it's called the Panhandle. That's also areas where the land is cheaper. The load is down in these areas along the coast. And so what they did was they developed the Texas Competitive Renewable Energy Zone, where they allowed investment in the areas with the high wind. These are substations and transmission lines, and they brought it down to the load centers. So that's a nice example where the capacity is concentrated in places with the higher wind resources. You get higher capacity factor. Finally, financing support. Why? Basically, you do have to mitigate the risks associated with renewables, at least in the early stages. And that's partly because when investors and bankers look at a variable plant, they're going to say, how do you know what your capacity factor is going to be? You don't control the wind or the sun. How do you know whether the grid is going to be able to take it? With a standard baseload thermal plant, you can plan in advance with the utility exactly what capacity factor you're going to achieve, although a competitive wholesale market will influence that. So you do have risks that are common early on. We're currently working on a taxonomy of financing and other incentives to try to get a handle on A, what are the major incentives today, and B, what are the key trends. So with that said, I'd just like to go back and make one comment that bears on our building blocks. What is USAID doing with these building blocks? We have identified them. I have to say, we've relied quite heavily on Bloomberg's database to verify that these building blocks are valid empirically. We've also had discussions with leading renewable energy specialists in places like a university in Ireland, which specializes in wind, some MIT folks who work on solar. And now that we have some confidence that we're reasonably on target with the building blocks, that we've identified them, we've dissected them, we've done cataloging of what are the different sub-characteristics of the building blocks, we're trying to install these building blocks in our new clean energy designs around the world. It's always negotiated with the host government and with our USAID missions, but we're explaining that if you really want to go to scale, you want to go from deploying 100 megawatts here and there to 1,000 megawatts a year, you need to begin thinking about these things that are driving scale in countries that are on track to do that. So with that said, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask both Steph and Alan to come on up here too. And at this point, I just want to give especially for the people that are listening online, just a little bit of who your other let's go back, rather than keep a picture on all of us. And I wanted to give you just a little bit of a glimpse of the audience so far. We have been putting out polling questions during this webinar, and to give you a little bit of feel for who's listening in so far. We've got about 25% of the people listening through the webinar are not involved actually with private sector climate financing too. However, what we've got is about 31% of the people registering. And do you know what the total number is on the webinar at this point? Okay, 35 folks are listening on the webinar. Most of those people that are involved with climate financing are from the public sector, 7% too. What's interesting is, again, about 34%, if I read these numbers correctly, are public donors, and I'll get into one of the questions regarding public donor money and how to best utilize public donor money. And I might bring also some of our USAID colleagues I see sitting around here, into some of those discussions. But I think it's important to see that the project developers are representing about 23% in actually the attendance of this webinar. So I think that's an important issue to think about, how many project developers are actually listening in and listening to some of the patterns that are going on now. Then we've got a breakdown about government and consulting is 15% each. So these numbers do add up to 100, I'm told, and I'll just take that on faith at this point. But then a third question was, what area, if you are focusing in on private financing for climate change? You have for clean energy about 50% of the participants in webinar, and you've got about 33%, interestingly, who are looking at the financing for sustainable landscapes, whereas you've got about 17% who are listening that are focused on adaptation. And to those folks on sustainable landscapes, the next talk will be really focused on financing for sustainable landscapes. And whereas the initial outline of talks, we said we'd do it together, sustainable landscapes and adaptation, we've decided, since they're pretty big topics in themselves, to break them up. So you'll be seeing on April 14th a discussion about sustainable landscapes, which includes agriculture and forestry, and then adaptation will be on a later talk too. Where are the countries? We've got some folks from Bangladesh, Mexico, the Philippines, and the Dominican Republic, and we have folks coming in from the University of Michigan, who are our partners also on CEADIR too. And then within the Washington metro area, we've got USAID, WRI, the Inter-American Development Bank, and some IFC folks too. So with that, I'd like to start off and have Alan and Stephen just sort of ask each other questions. If you were to go to Bloomberg, and I know you have done that, or vice versa, and knowing what you know from the Climatescopes right now, knowing what you know from your startup and your building blocks, what would you go to them now and say, these one or two areas are where we really could use some more help? And you focusing in on data, or you helping about what are you hearing that the countries need? So your data and the country needs part of it too. Okay.
I can jump in. I thought the building block presentation was most useful because and specifically, I thought when you address the variability in terms of, yeah, I can go for that. Addressing the variability by taking an area approach, I think deserved the attention that you gave it, because it really does address probably the biggest perceived risk.
That's slide 30.
With projects. In other words, the grid, really that was in the context of grid integration. To get to Marcy's question though, I wanted to hear a little bit more about, or I would like to hear now a little bit more about financing support and what USAID is undertaking with regard to that building block, because perhaps it's because of our own bias. I mean, finance is part of our name, but we certainly see that as a very key ingredient, if you will, in the pie in terms of NGO, public sector support to more or less get the match lit. So I was hoping you could talk about a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephen. What we're noticing is that there is an extremely strong trend for donors to get out of generation. Generation, they did pilots for years and years and years in generation. And now the emphasis is shifting toward transmission infrastructure, system operating capacity, things like synchrophasers, the equipment that you add onto it. The Germans and others are focusing on areas like renewable energy management centers that have forecasting capability. And frankly, if you look at if you follow the money, what you're seeing is that the donors are moving into the grid integration space, with transmission being the most expensive piece of that puzzle, as well as to the soft areas. And then just one other comment on that, the donors are also now beginning to get involved in that locational concentration area that is helping with the development of large solar parks or concentrated wind areas.
Well, that dovetails nicely with what we're seeing in that when you look at solar and wind, the primary generation technologies in both of those, in the case of solar, we're talking about modules, and in the case of wind, we're talking about turbines, have really come down almost to a commoditized level. Now, Vestas and SunPower would hate to hear me say that, but in fact, we think there's a lot of truth to that. Where cost savings can be achieved, where additional economies can be realized, is in areas such as what Alan's describing, or what we call the balance of system, if you will. Everything ranging from the little widgets on the back of the inverters that go on the back of modules to various transmission components. I would add to that, though, that the cost of land and the availability of land is a place where a lot of progress can be made if it is further institutionalized and concentrated, if you will, in the form of donor organizations who would focus specifically on land acquisition and the legal issues that surround land acquisition, especially in a lot of countries where property records and title issues are paramount.
Yeah, good. I have a question for you, Stephen. When I look at the Bloomberg data on generation capacity increments that are added each semi-annual period or each year, it seems pretty clear to me that the majority of capacity is in solar PV and in onshore wind. Can you comment on that trend? Are those two technologies going to continue to dominate in the next few years in the scale up? And how do we view the technologies that are really much smaller in terms of the megawatts, like geothermal and biomass?
Yeah, well, solar is, after all, for the most part, is a silicon-based technology, and so it's subject in many ways to the economics that we see with silicon and other applications. And by that, I'm simply saying that the future for photovoltaics, silicon-based photovoltaics, and non-silicon-based is very bright. The technologies are transportable. The manufacturing technologies themselves are easily exportable and knock down and bring up form in the rest of the world. So PV is the future of solar, notwithstanding solar thermal, which has, as I said in my presentation, good applications in limited areas. In the case of wind, it's a little bit more complicated because onshore wind clearly has a an historical and a long-term cost advantage. Offshore wind, on the other hand, has the merit of resource. the offshore wind resource is a, pardon the metaphor, but it's a powerful thing. I mean, the best wind resources in the world are offshore wind resources. And so if the objective here is to pursue and install generating technology where the resources are great, then we're going to have to go offshore. The hindrance there is that the cost of offshore wind doesn't show any sign of coming into the range of competing technologies anytime soon. With regard to the other technologies, geothermal, let's talk about geothermal. Geothermal is geographically constrained. And not only is it geographically constrained, but the geothermal resources that remain unexploited are very constrained in terms of their proximity to load centers. I mean, there's great geothermal resources in Antarctica, and there's excellent geothermal resources in many archipelagos of the world, but there's no way to get that power, the generated power, to load centers that is anything close to economical. That's put a natural ceiling on what we see for geothermal. Biofuel. We're all, I think, aware of the cost issues related to biofuels and the policy issues related to conventional biofuels and the competition that they do or are perceived to present to food resources in the world. So there's an issue with that. What am I leaving out? Hydro. There's a great deal of hydro potential in the developing world. As a matter of fact, that's where most of the remaining hydro potential exists. The issues related to hydro, I think, are pretty well known by now, which is that in the case of large hydro, you're talking displacement of both residential use and agricultural use. In the case of small hydro, you're talking about diversions of streams that have a great deal of potential for their water supply further downstream. So bottom line to close it up is that wind and solar are the large-scale growth channels as far as what we can see now. Call us crazy optimists, but we also hold out a lot of potential for both nuclear technologies, fission, which I guess we all know what fission is about, and fusion, which is a raging argument inside of BNEF in terms of when we will really be able to see the application of fusion technologies, to address these issues.
And people also from the CEADIR project too. So those of you in the audience here might want to be talking not only to us afterwards, but we've got people like Zephyr Taylor is one of our activity managers on CEADIR too, and we've got Yun Lee over there to the, well, at least to my left and all, and he's our COR for the project. We've got Colin Green in here, and he's managing the GCC, a lot of the LEDS work. Mike Colby, I see, and I don't know if I've left out any other folks too. I believe there might be some other folks from USAID. But from your perspectives on where you're going right now with this sort of financing, and particularly from the GCC perspective, how do you see their presentations fitting into one, where you're going, but also what would you like to see continued, and really to get a little bit deeper to serve the countries now, as you work a lot with bilateral missions too. So I don't know who wants to take that question first, but.
I think we're starting to open up our portfolio of support for a variety of financing instruments and initiatives. I think market reform and development has been kind of the hallmark of our financing work for clean energy, particularly for the last many years. And we really look at that as kind of the paramount or foundational approach to building sustainable markets that can scale up climate mitigating technologies. I think with that, I'd like to actually turn it over quickly to Steph to ask, where does BNEF see, or Bloomberg New Energy Finance, see the most promise in terms of innovative financing mechanisms and instruments going forward? And I think this would be particularly helpful for us to include and consider in our programming going, looking into the future for USAID. So.
Well, there's no doubt that if you look at recent experience, that green bonds, so-called green bonds, are where a lot of activity has been taking place that has resulted in real money. I mean, in other words, it's not just wheel spinning, but their financings via green bonds have really begun to gel. However, I can't say that I'm not myself familiar with the split between the application of green bonds between the so-called developing and the developed economies. Clearly, green bonds have a lot of traction and a lot of potential in the developed economies, and perhaps, I don't know, perhaps Alan has something to say about how they can be used elsewhere. With regard to other mechanisms, I think that this is a negative answer to what you're saying. The operation of state development banks is closely tied to the availability of cheap money, and cheap money is on a leash here. I mean, there's a timer associated with low-cost capital throughout the world, or I should say throughout the capital-driven world, and so as a result, we're not overly sanguine about the continued ability of state development banks to play the kind of role that they have been playing. And I'd cite an example in Brazil's bank, which goes by the acronym BNEF, has really been forced, or is in the process of being forced to withdraw to a significant extent from the clean energy field, just because of other priorities and shrinking capital. Unfortunately, that may be replicated elsewhere.
I think that's actually a very interesting point, Stephen, because I've been hearing almost the opposite, which is the national development banks, and I think that has to do with some of the Green Climate Fund coming along too, that they need to ramp up for funds possibly coming through there. But what you're saying is that as those banks mature and as the markets mature within the countries and clean, if you will, donor funds become less over time, they seem to play a little bit less of a role. Who's picking up the slack then, too?
Well, looking at the part of the world that I'm most familiar with, I think that the presence of local lenders, and I'm talking about private sector lenders. And by the way, when I talk about the world that I'm familiar with, it's my focus, my own. U.S.-based and local is growing rapidly in North, Central, and South America, and I think that our position is that the penetration by private lending institutions, both offshore and local, is going to grow, is growing, and will continue to grow, commensurate with the comfort level that we're seeing lenders have with clean energy projects increasing, and that comfort level is increasing. I mean, as far as finances, as far as private finance goes, clean energy, at least when we talk about wind and solar, utility scale wind and solar, is no longer an alternative investment, at least among a sizable minority of them, and I think it's growing to majority status. When Goldman Sachs is making these kind of investments, that's one thing, but when PNC Bank, a regional bank based in Pittsburgh, is committing capital to clean energy projects outside of the U.S. That's quite another thing, and we're seeing that now too.
Can I comment on that as well? I think that from a policy point of view, donors should view their role as shifting from demonstrating the technologies, which was traditional over the last 30 years or so, to the what did you call them? They're the other factors that enable a renewable energy generator.
System or whatever.
And so you hear, for example, in the U.S. about the working group of DOE and NREL that's working on de-risking wind, for example. So if the projects can be de-risked by good grid code and by an adequate forecasting system and by the grid and operating capacity to take all of the energy that's output from the plant, the lenders are going to see it as a more viable, more standard credit, or as a bond asset. And so it makes sense that the lenders now begin a process of shifting toward the grid's capacity to deal with renewable energy. It's demonstrated as viable. And with the other stuff that has to go into the grid, not just the towers and lines, but the synchrophasers and so forth.
Okay, we have some questions in the webinar also. And Joan will be asking those.
Great. Shayan Shafi from Bangladesh asked, what are the elements BNEF looks at to determine how friendly a particular country is for climate investment?
Well, we have, when we talk about that, let's talk about Climatescope. I mean, we've developed a uniform system of parameters, and we weight them. The most heavily weighted parameter is policy support. When we talk about the developing world, what we look at is the actions that have been taken by the government in support of clean energy development, which can range from things that have been discussed today, like feed-in tariffs or reverse auctions, to various tax breaks for land, or even tax breaks on the capital investment, or I should say on capital returns. Other parameters include, let's see, it's policy framework. Let me. I know that the presence of green mechanisms, UN green mechanisms, and the adoption of those is a factor. And there's a couple of others that I can look up if you'd like to hit Alan with a question, and I can pull out my little cheat sheet. So.
All right, next question. Eric Hyman from USAID asked, are the LCOE estimates for solar and wind adjusted for actual usable power?
I think that's a BNEF.
I'm sorry, repeat it, please.
Are the LCOE estimates for solar and wind adjusted for actual usable power?
Actual usable power, did you say? Well, I have to confess, it's a little hard to understand what the term usable power means, but let me tell you what LCOE is for us. LCOE is a string of payments over a set period of time, usually 25 years, that on a present value basis would compensate the developer for the costs of putting the project in. So, I mean, if we have a $25 million project, then we're talking about $1 million. We're talking about the amount of payments that would equal $1 million on a present value basis per year. So I'm sorry if I'm not responding exactly to that, but I guess I'd need to know a little bit more about what is meant by usable power. For capacity factors? Okay.
Also time of day value. So if
Right.
your FIT is 10 cents a kilowatt hour and the wholesale market at night when you have the power is 1 cent, which price do you use?
Okay, well, the answer to that is we do LCOEs for time of use environments on a regional and country basis. What I showed today was a global average. And I don't know, I rather doubt that any time of use variability went into that. I think we were really just talking about annual averages. And by the way, to finish up on that other question, let me just quickly mention the other parameters that we use for assessment. I mentioned enabling framework. That's what I was talking about when I talked about policy. The second most weighted one was clean energy and climate financing, which is a quantitative number. Finally, the third one is low carbon business and clean energy value chains, where we assess the presence in country of organizations that actually can supply either capital or equipment to projects. And then finally, the greenhouse gas management activities, which are the UN, primarily UN affiliated CO2 mitigation memberships.
Let me follow up with that, and then we'll go to another question in the audience. It's been brought out that BNEF right now is not does not appear to be estimating the amount of GHG emission reductions associated with these clean energy investments. Is that a data point that you could in the future start to pull in? The idea being that a lot, of course, with the LEDs policies, what we're aiming at is not just a matter of getting a cost competitive in, but also ensuring that emission reductions are happening. Is that something that
Sure.
you could envision tracking in the future?
Well,
because my point is not, it's not just important, it's important for the countries, particularly as they do their INDCs going forward too, and they've got to start to monitor and verify those emission reductions over time.
Well, our position, I'll just tell you our position. Our position is to consciously, we have consciously avoided attempting to link GHG reduction levels with projects or policies because we believe that that data need, that informational need is being adequately handled by non-commercial organizations. Likewise, although it wasn't part of your question, we also don't, we're not attempting to tie employment levels to clean energy projects or policies for a somewhat similar reason. In other words, we feel that these are already addressed by other activities. If there's anybody in the audience who believes that they are inadequately addressed, I think you can find my email address or my contact information in the presentation, and we'd like to hear from you.
Hi. It's on. Okay. Thanks for the excellent presentations. I'm Eric Hochstausen with USAID, and I wanted to ask you about the Green Climate Fund, which Marcia mentioned. I think probably most of those in the audience know the Green Climate Fund is an emerging development in the climate finance landscape. It's there are over $10 billion in pledges, and I guess my question for you is, if and it's a multi-donor, multilateral fund. My question for you is, if you were advising the Green Climate Fund, do you believe that this is that clean energy is an area that, or renewable energy development is an area that merits the attention of the fund, and perhaps more importantly, you know, where would you advise the fund to focus its interventions in the coming years? What role can a multi-donor fund like that play in this landscape?
I don't specialize in public sector funds generally, but I believe that having funds that are long tenor and relatively low interest rate is important at this stage in the market. It enables renewable generation to more quickly approach parity with competing thermal technologies. And this is a period of time in which we don't, I mean, I really am resistant to the idea that we know the prices of renewables. BNEF knows the prices because they take the actual PPA values, which are the bid values, which are the empirical values. But those prices reflect all of the enabling conditions and subsidies and so forth. And so I think there's still a role for a $10 billion fund to lend at quasi-commercial terms, particularly in markets where the private market is still reluctant to come in a big way and to stimulate early investment in the market, basically to demonstrate the viability and the price competitiveness of well-structured, competitively procured renewable generation projects.
And from your earlier statement, it sounds a little bit like some of the best use of the funds is not anymore in the demonstration side of it or pilot projects per se, but it could be used with the sort of planning aspect and the synchronization aspect and the grid integration aspect, that is an area where resources are tending to go or are needed.
Yes, resources are flowing into grid integration. For just as an example, it's my understanding that CREZ is predominantly private sector infrastructure investment. India is doing BOO transmission lines from high resource areas. So there is an opportunity to make money, to lend into the other parts of the system. Balance system is what Stephen referred to. Mm-hmm. And secondarily, as a complement, so it doesn't displace private capital, but possibly reduces risks or demonstrates scale. Those are important qualities.
Yeah, all I'd add to that is that we believe that globally, clean energy is still capital constrained on balance, and $10 billion is a lot of money. We also believe that that's true. So there's clearly a dovetail there. If you go back to the origins of clean energy policy, in other words, the reasons why it exists, it has to do with greenhouse gases and controlling greenhouse gases, and we know that we're not on track to do so at a level that there's a consensus is necessary. So I mean, the $10 billion or whatever, which is growing, should be applied to mitigate greenhouse gases where climate, I'm just summing up here, where capital is scarce. And I guess the only step I go beyond what Alan says is we think that those areas are India and Africa. I'm grossly generalizing, but I think that
I have one little point to attach to Stephen's comment there. We as in the public sector community, we have to be wary of situations where capital is scarce because projects are highly risky. And I came from a power sector reform, and I negotiated a bunch of thermal plants. But in some situations, the reason capital is scarce and high priced is because the electricity sector is insolvent. It happens in countries where we work. And you can't mitigate those risks, the risk of an insolvent off-taker with low-cost public capital.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. It's an excellent point.
Joan, there's other questions from our web audience?
Yes. David Rogers said that the presentations were excellent, but he would like it to comment on currency risk issues, for example, in India, and how IFI can help address this issue.
Go ahead.
Well, I've worked a lot in the Indian market over the years for maybe 20 years, and there is a tendency to, not a tendency, there is a strong trend to shift FX risk to the developers a long time ago. That was in the 90s. And the tendency is still not to put the FX risk on the off-taker, the utilities. What I've seen in the market is, for example, IFC going in and issuing $1 billion bond in Indian rupees for partly for renewable energy finance. And then there's a lot of discussion of hedging products for that exposure.
Yeah, all I'd add is that I don't anticipate there being any sea change in where the risk is attached. It's going to continue to be attached to the developer, and I'd go out on a limb and say I think that's probably appropriate when you talk about relative sophistication in a lot of these markets.
I thank you for presentations. It's on? Okay. I'm Ted Kennedy. I've worked in the European carbon market in the World Bank, and it's a bit of an elephant in the room question. I don't mean to put anybody on the spot. It was touched on a little bit about the driving force between a lot of this being climate change mitigation. And if we're talking about capital constraints, I'm curious, maybe it's a question for BNEF about if we have capital constraints and we actually have some really interesting and competitive price points on some of the key renewable technologies now, but we still have a bit of a free pass or a discounted ride ticket for a lot of the conventional fossil fuels. And I'm wondering, do you see any trends towards localized carbon pricing, either on an implicit basis, a shadow price against the fossils, or even a carbon tax where some of the proceeds might even be turned towards further support of the cleaner technologies? Because it seems that we're kind of we're talking about climate change mitigation,
Yeah.
and as you said, we are behind the 8 ball on this. We're not really moving quickly enough, but we're not really addressing where a lot of the initial source of the problem came from, and maybe milking that for a source of finance. Thanks.
Well, certainly the movement that we see towards localized, regionalized carbon markets or carbon pricing schemes, for the most part, is confined to what we would call the developed world, with the exception of China. And it remains to be seen, and I certainly can't I'm not in position to even attempt to forecast what's going to happen in China. That's probably, it's China. China's where, I think the locus of this particular question really resides, because China is where a carbon market would, by definition, I think, on the basis of scale and growth, have the most effect.
I don't have a comment.
Okay, Joan?
Last question from the webinar audience. Debbie Stone says, I am anxious to know how this group might help to identify equity that is willing to invest in markets we are discussing today. Equity that is strategic to buy down the amount of equity required is critical. She's specifically looking at El Salvador, Guatemala, and Ghana.
Do you have any thoughts on this? Obviously,
you know what I'd like to suggest. I don't. I think it's an excellent question, and it clearly is coming from somebody who, is attempting to get something done. I would call their attention to Climatescope, which is, just Google Climatescope online, and look at our section for El Salvador, which is, perhaps can serve as a primer on what's going on there now in terms of actual organizations and lending institutions that are active.
I haven't thought about how equity is mobilized for the clean energy sector much, but one point that strikes me from my presentation is that one means of mobilizing capital generally and equity as part of the capital structure is by doing reverse auctions, where you let the market say what they need to come in. And the way that it's been done, as Stephen referred to in South Africa, for example, or in Brazil, is that you have an aggressive target over a 3 or 5 year period for capacity that really moves the needle. But you start small, knowing that the market is timid in the beginning and equity is hiding in corners. And as you begin to see prices revealed, equity is going to come out as they see projects that get successfully awarded and commissioned and so forth. So that's one way of stimulating that part of the capital structure.
one thing I'd like to just add to that is CEADIR has been looking at some of those markets, and hopefully over the next 6 months we'll be having some publications coming out and distributed in which they are talking about working with BNEF on some of the data about where the funds are coming for a lot of the renewable energy, specifically in the Central American countries, El Salvador and Guatemala being two of those, another one Honduras possibly. But it's, it is something that it needs to be looked at, is how much have they stimulated the equity market going on board. What we can say is that for most of the financing, according to the Climatescope and BNEF work for Latin America, is that yes, indeed, it's a few banks, some of them regional banks like CABE, and this is not equity money, obviously. This is asset financing money or the project financing money too. But also there are a few local banks too that stand out. What you do see, and in that first slide that I showed you, where you had a pie chart, is obviously a fair amount of the money is coming from equity investments too. Mm-hmm. Private companies are raising it. So that's a very good question for us to really look at more detail. Is initially a lot more is coming from equity. How much then will it transition over time to be the banks coming on too? Yeah. And I think those are fair questions for us to be looking at, not only at USAID, but in many of the other projects, and perhaps BNEF too over time. Okay, we've reached 10:30, at which point we said we would close. I don't know if there's any final question from the audience here, but if not, we'll close up, and then I'll just ask you guys to stay tuned. On April 14th is the next CEADIR series, and I don't know if there's any other final questions. No? But then feel free to come out and talk to the people here. And we hope to see you back